OpenBSD 7.6 has added support for WAPI for Intel and AMD GPUs. In the last video, I have demonstrated how to install a proper Intel WAPI driver, since there are two drivers available for Intel card. If you are a AMD GPU user, you don't need to be worried about anything because it's already enabled for you by default. The intention of this video is to demonstrate how to enable hardware rendering on three applications: Firefox, FFmpeg, and MPV. So we can actually make use of our GPU in video encoding and decoding. So let's start with Firefox. The first thing we have to do is to open two tabs: about config and about support. Most probably you already have everything enabled for you by default, but just in case, you better check it, and if it's not, then just enable it. And then also we do kind of like a performance comparison on YouTube in terms of like drop frames. I have disabled it by intention, all the hardware acceleration on my side, to show you what flag you should use and you should enable. So to know whether you are using any hardware acceleration, go to the about support and search first for compositing, and here we see that it is mentioned web render software. This is wrong, it should be web render. If you have software, means it uses basically your GPU. And the second thing is to search for hardware video decoding. Here it states that it's available but it's disabled by user. Again, I have disabled this stuff intentionally. It was enabled for me. But now let's go and basically do a simple performance comparison. So here is a 4K video, 30 FPS, and we are going to play it, and we see actually the drop frame. So here we have actually drop frame even on 720p, right? You see it's a massive drop frame, everything is slow and so on. And I'm not gonna open even this one. This is basically 60 FPS and it's gonna be much worse. So in order to enable it, go to the about config and search for, first of all, GFX, web render, and then we should actually look for a software one. So web render.software. Make sure that this is disabled. And the second parameter that we have to look for is media.hardware video decoding enabled. So make sure that this is enabled. So you have to disable web render software and enable media hardware video decoding. Once you have done that, you can actually restart your Firefox. So I'm gonna close my Firefox, open again, and then we are going to do a comparison. So now let's see what's the drop frame situation. And we see that at least on 720 we do not have any drop frame, and if we try to go actually upper 1080, maybe we will have, maybe we don't. It's something that I am also checking at the same time of recording this video. So we do not have any drop frame. And if we are going above 2K, let's see, probably we will have some drop frame. And I'm kind of impressed, to be honest, on my T480. I don't have a drop frame on 2K 30 frame per second. Because also at the same time I'm kind of recording this video on the same device. So on 4K we have a very bad drop frame. Now if we are going to the 60 FPS by comparison, we will have drop frame nevertheless. I have tested on this one actually. So 4K, don't mention it, you can see it's already super slow, and my CPU is actually spiking up pretty badly. So I'm gonna go lower it down to 720p and we get some stats for nerds, and still we have drop frames. This is something at this point that I cannot do much about it, based on both kind of like a software limitation and also hardware limitation. You can do one more trick, depend on your hardware. It can actually kind of help you or not, and that is installing Enhance Edge 26 for. So This plugin, when you install it, what you can do with it is to actually kind of like state whether you want to block different kind of video decoding or not. Depends on what your GPU supports. For instance, I am using ThinkPad T480. It's shipped with the 8th Gen Core i CPU, and this one actually doesn't support AV1, but it supports VP8 and VP9. So if the video basically is rendered or is streamed with the AV1, but then my CPU actually has to encode to decode it. Whereas if it's a VP8 and VP9, then my GPU can do it as well. So in my case, the optimized, let's say, solution is VP8 and VP9. So I can just remove it. And also I can just block 60 FPS because we have seen it that things isn't working. But again, this is something to experiment with it, and it requires you to search a bit on what sort of hardware video decoding your graphic card can support, and then tweak the options based on what you need. Now let's move on to the next part, which is about enabling hardware decoding on MPV. So here I have actually two videos stored in 4K. One is MP4 and one is WebM. If you want to use MPV with the hardware decoding, so HV decode to auto, and then we set the profile to fast, and I'm just gonna play the video playback, and you can see actually this is 4K displaying and I don't have any drop frames. So on browser 4K isn't really working, but here it's working fine, and this is actually 60 FPS. It's the same video that I couldn't basically watch on browser. I can watch it actually in the MPV without any problem, and the drop frame is a non-existence literally. The same video I have with actually MP4. So here pay attention that this is VP9. So my GPU actually supports that, right? But if I use actually MP4, here you can see actually it's failing because it says there is no support for AV1. This is for the hardware rendering, and you can see actually my CPU is spiking up completely and we have a very bad drop frame. So don't be disappointed when you are seeing, okay, one 4K video works, another one doesn't work. It's just a matter of what sort of codec your hardware supports. Like again, in my case doesn't support AV1, but it supports VP8, VP9. No problem with the VP8, VP9, but there is a huge lag with the AV1 because it falls back to the CPU. Here you see using hardware decoding, here it says your platform doesn't support hardware acceleration AV1 decoding. And if I just remove all these parameters and just display it like this, it's the same as before, very terrible drop frame. And if I basically do with the WebM, we can see it's also terrible because again it uses my CPU. Now on the last one is about FFmpeg, and I have to actually use something else to demonstrate to you, not this browser. Open Chromium here. For FFmpeg, things are a bit more complicated because you need to pass a bunch of flags, and these flags are not really easy demonstratable. If you remember, in one of my old videos long time ago, around a year ago, I have actually shared on how I record my videos on OpenBSD, and I shared this repository with you that had actually a screencast as well as a streaming on OpenBSD plus creating the YouTube short. I have enriched this repository. I make sure to also link it in the video description, and I added actually the script for the hardware rendering as well. Let's quickly compare these two, a screencast and a screencast hardware rendering or hardware encoding, and just point out the differences. So I'm gonna zoom in a bit here. Okay, here we have zoom in already. Fantastic. So here we can see it's just using for the video encoder, it's using libx264RGB. This is software encoding or CPU encoding. If you are using CPU encoder, usually you have a more crispier kind of output the colors would be nicer. It's superior when you are using software encoding, at least for Intel graphics. I am not sure about the AMD or NVIDIA at all. For the video encoder, we are using this one. Whereas for the hardware one, we are using actually H.264 WAPI. And also here we added a hardware acceleration, and this one is mentioned that our hardware acceleration is WAPI, and this is the device, that's the WAPI device. And here also we add a video, I think, format. So these are the differences. You may ask, how did I find out about this stuff? I went to the both ArchWiki as well as the FFmpeg help pages to figure out how to use WAPI. So the differences are not that much, but again, I cannot just keep typing here on this video for 5 minutes to just show you how to do the recording. You can just go and directly make use of these scripts in the repository. About the FFmpeg, if you want to know everything that I explained, you can also go to this documentation I created on installing a proper Intel WAPI driver, as well as verification of it, and finally make use of the sort of the hardware encoder. Also, one thing I have forgot to mention, which I now remember looking at the documentation, is that how you know which sort of hardware encoder to use, because here I have used H.264 WAPI. You may say this is very arbitrary and random. Is not. You can just open a terminal and see your WAPI supports what sort of hardware encoding, and here we see that it has H.264 WAPI, VP8, VP9. We don't see, for example, AV1 here because my actually graphic card is very old by now. It's 6 years, 7 years old. So I could use potentially VP8, VP9, but I end up with the H.264. This is something kind of more mainstream compared to VP8 and VP9. That's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank all of the amazing Patreon and Ko-fi supporters. Your generosity and support means the world to me and keeps me really motivated to continue creating content. Thanks again for your generosity and contribution.